They left me humiliated, a discarded bride with frostbite on her fingers and shame in her throat. But I didn't crawl into the wilderness to die. I came to remember how to fight. And when 3 armed men broke through our snow-covered silence, I didn't hesitate. I reminded them exactly what a woman like me is capable of. The wind didn't just cut, it hunted. A blade honed by years of silence and frost, it tore across the plains like it had a score to settle. The land stretched endless and indifferent, stripped of color and mercy, pressing down with a sky the color of old iron, the kind that remembers blood. Jedediah rode through it like a ghost with unfinished business. 5 winters had carved him into something more stone than man, something the prairie couldn't kill but no longer cared to welcome. Behind him, the town was just a bruise on the horizon, a place that had once held laughter, now reduced to whispers and closed doors. They had buried his name in sideways glances and shallow pity. But he hadn't come back to be pitied. As he dismounted, the snow thickened, a white shroud twisting through the air like it knew what was coming. His mare, Bess, didn't fight the wind. She lowered her head, her breath harsh and steaming, eyes dull with exhaustion. Like her rider, she'd seen too much to spook. The cabin loomed ahead, not as shelter, but as witness. Every timber still remembered her, the one whose laughter used to soften the edges of his silence. Martha, gone like breath in winter. The door creaked open beneath his hand, a sound more like warning than welcome. Inside, the cold greeted him with open arms. He didn't shiver. He hadn't shivered in years. Not since he learned that sometimes the only thing colder than the wind is what you carry inside. The silence greeted him like an old friend, one that had overstayed its welcome. It was colder in here than outside, the fire long dead, the embers reduced to ash. He moved quickly, shedding his gear, his hands stiff and cold, but his heart even colder. The place hadn't changed much. The same rough-hewn walls, the same dark corners where shadows seemed to hang on longer than they should. And as always, there was the echo of her laughter, Martha's laughter, lingering in the cracks of the floorboards, the empty space where she used to stand. Jedediah ran his hand over the table, worn and battered from years of use. He could almost hear her, her voice a soft melody that made the hard edges of life feel like they could be softened, like they could be forgotten. But that was before. Now, all he had left was the weight of her absence and the gnawing hunger for something he couldn't name. He moved through the cabin with the mechanical precision of a man who had done it 1,000 times, but it didn't make it any easier. The cabin, the boy, the land, none of it brought him peace, none of it was enough. His eyes fell on the small cot in the corner, the faded blankets tangled and twisted, as if Finn had been tossing and turning in his sleep, the boy's dreams as dark as the nights they spent alone. Jedediah had left him in town again, with Mrs. Blackwood, a kind woman, as far as anyone could tell, but Jedediah had never trusted anyone with Finn for long. The preacher's wife was good to him, sure, but Jedediah's world was filled with too many shadows for him to hand his boy over to someone else for any real length of time. He sat down heavily, the old chair creaking beneath him. The fire pit was still cold, the air around it stagnant, the smell of old wood and ash hanging in the air. The silence here was suffocating. It always had been. When Martha was alive, she had a way of filling the empty spaces, of bringing warmth to a place that should have been forgotten. But now, it was just him, and the ghosts. He rubbed his face, feeling the roughness of his stubble, the weight of the day clinging to him. He thought about Finn, about how the boy barely spoke anymore, his eyes too old for someone so young. Finn had been a shadow of what he once was, a boy who once laughed and played, who had once fought with the same fire Jedediah had in him. But life had worn that out of him, like it had worn out Jedediah too. The regret was always there, like a hole in his chest that only grew larger with every passing day. He thought of Martha, her laughter, her warmth. She had been the light in this cabin, the thing that had kept him from turning completely to stone. Now, there was just the cold, just the ache. He closed his eyes and let the memories wash over him, a flood of pain and guilt. But it was too late for that now. The boy needed more than memories. The boy needed to be saved. The sound of hooves outside jerked him back to the present. The sharp crack of the cold air filled with the echo of approaching riders. His heart jumped. Strangers didn't ride this far out unless they had business. He stood quickly, reaching for the rifle resting by the door, his fingers cold as he wrapped them around the stock. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer. Jedediah stepped to the door, opening it just enough to peer out into the swirling snow. 3 men were approaching, riding low and slow, the kind of movement that made him uneasy. He couldn't see their faces, but the way they held themselves, their posture, the way they kept their distance, told him everything he needed to know. They weren't here to chat. He didn't make a move, just stood there, watching them, the rifle steady in his hands. The first man, the leader, finally spoke. "We're looking for shelter," he called out, his voice gruff, as if the cold had sucked the warmth from his words. "We've been on the trail for days, ain't asking for much, just a place to rest." Jedediah didn't lower the rifle. "Ain't got much to share," he said, his voice low, rough, and colder than the wind. The man on the horse looked past Jedediah at the faint glow from inside the cabin. "We ain't asking for charity," he said, his tone more forceful. "You got more than you need, and we're here to take it." Jedediah's heart tightened, his knuckles white on the rifle. "You don't take nothing from me," he said, his voice hard, steady. "This here's mine, and if you want it, you'll have to fight for it." The rider gave a humorless chuckle, but before he could say another word, a shot rang out from inside the cabin. The man's hat flew off, the bullet clipping the brim. His eyes went wide, and he ducked instinctively as the other 2 men scrambled to draw their guns. Jedediah turned, looking at her. She was standing there in the doorway, the rifle steady in her hands, eyes cold as stone. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She just stood there, like a wall of iron, protecting what was hers. "You heard him," she said, her voice quiet, but every word hit with the force of 1,000 storms. "This ain't your place." The men didn't need another invitation. They turned their horses and galloped off into the snow without another word, their figures swallowed by the white void of the night. Jedediah stood there for a long moment, staring at her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said everything. She had stood between him and the death they would have brought, just like that. That night, after the fire was stoked and the door was bolted tight, Jedediah poured her the last of the coffee. The warmth of the fire seemed to melt something inside him. He finally spoke, his voice rough with a year's worth of unsaid words. "I never asked your name," he said quietly. She looked at him, the firelight flickering in her eyes. "You never needed to," she replied. The storm outside raged on, but for the first time in a long time, Jedediah didn't feel so alone. The wind howled around him, its icy fingers scraping against the barren landscape like 1,000 whispers. Jedediah stood at the edge of the town, the cold biting through his coat, his breath coming in ragged clouds. He'd been walking these streets for days now, not for any particular reason, just moving, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on him. It was a familiar kind of quiet, the kind that swallowed a man whole if he wasn't careful. He'd come to town for supplies, for something to keep the days from bleeding into one another. The same monotonous grind, the same hollow feeling in his chest. But today, there was something different, something out of place. His boots crunched on the frozen earth as he made his way past the church. The old building loomed like a forgotten monument to a time long past. As he neared the bulletin board, his eyes caught on a scrap of paper flapping wildly in the wind, its edges torn and ragged. A letter. A letter that no one seemed to care about. He stopped, his heart lurching in his chest. The wind tugged at the paper, but it held fast to the board, as if it had a story to tell. Something about it called to him. A compulsion, like a rope around his throat. He reached out, tearing it free from the nails that held it in place. The words on the page were crude, written in a jagged, angry script that looked like it had been scrawled in desperation. Jedediah scanned the letter, his eyes narrowing as the words sank in. It was about a woman named Elara Vance. 60 years old, jilted at the altar. The groom had seen her, looked her over, and turned on his heel, disappearing halfway through the vows. A woman abandoned, her shame hanging like a noose around her neck. The letter spoke of her waiting in town, stranded, unable to leave until spring thawed the treacherous passes, and in the meantime, she was nothing but a whisper, a scandal on the lips of the townsfolk. Jedediah felt his throat tighten. He knew what it was like to be discarded, to be left with nothing but the memory of a love that had slipped through his fingers. He knew the ache of regret, the loneliness that gnawed at the edges of every damn day. But this was something else. The cruelty of it, the way they had treated her, the way they had turned her into a joke. He folded the letter, tucking it into his coat pocket, but his mind kept returning to it. Elara Vance. A woman humiliated by the world, left alone to wait for the winter to end, just like him, just like Finn. His boy. Jedediah turned toward the saloon, his boots dragging on the snow-covered ground. He didn't want to go in, didn't want to see the faces of the men who'd been gossiping about Elara, but he had no choice. He had to keep moving, or the thoughts would eat him alive. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the warmth from inside hitting him like a punch. The smell of whiskey and sweat mixed in the air, and the low murmur of conversation faded as the room took notice of him. "Jedediah!" Someone called from across the room, a man named Holt, his voice thick with the sound of too many drinks. "Still breathing, huh?" Jedediah didn't respond. He just made his way to the bar, his hand sliding over the rough wood as he leaned in. The bartender, a sour-looking man with a permanent frown, slid a glass of whiskey in front of him. Jedediah didn't ask for it, but he took it. He always took it. It was the only thing that dulled the ache even for a little while. "You seen that letter?" Holt asked, his voice low, like he was sharing some big secret. "That old woman. Got left standing at the altar like a damn fool. Ain't nobody want her. Poor thing." Jedediah's grip tightened on the glass. "She's still here, then?" "Yeah," Holt said with a sneer. "Can't leave, too damn proud to beg, but don't nobody want her. Ain't no place for women like that around here." Jedediah swallowed the whiskey in one burning gulp, his throat rough from both the liquor and the weight of the words. His heart thudded in his chest as he thought about Elara. She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve to be cast aside like some used-up thing. He turned on his heel, leaving the glass behind, his boots scraping against the floorboards. The door swung open with a creak, and the cold hit him again. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. Not the cold, not the damn town, not the endless silence. He had to find her, had to know her story, had to understand why he couldn't stop thinking about her. His mind drifted back to Finn. The boy hadn't said much lately, but Jedediah could feel the weight in his son's silence. Every time the boy looked at the empty chair at the supper table, Jedediah saw a question in his eyes. Will it always be just us? It didn't have to be that way. Maybe, just maybe, Elara could be the answer. Maybe they could build something together, something that wasn't broken. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and made his way through the snow, his footsteps leaving a trail that would soon be covered by the storm. The town was small, but there were corners where people went to hide. Elara would be hiding somewhere, waiting for the thaw, just like he had been. He found her behind the livery stable, sweeping the snow from a bench. Her eyes, hard and suspicious, flicked up when she heard him approach. You here to laugh too? She asked, her voice rough like gravel. Jedediah shook his head. I got a cabin, a boy, more quiet than a man ought to keep. I'm offering shelter, company. She stared at him, her eyes narrowing. Pity? Or something else? Jedediah hesitated, then took a step forward. I'm offering a chance, for both of us. We've got a lot to lose, but we've got a chance to start again, together. The wind howled around them, but it felt different now, like the world had shifted, just a little, just enough to make things feel possible. Ilara looked him over, her eyes softening for just a moment before she nodded. All right, she said, her voice quieter now. I'll take that chance. And just like that, they left town together. No fanfare, no talk. Only the sound of hooves in the snow and the weight of two broken souls finding their way to something new. Jedediah's boots crunched through the snow, each step heavier than the last. His body ached with the kind of fatigue only the land could breed, but his mind was sharper than it had been in years, drawn to the livery stable like a moth to a flame. He had no idea what he was doing here, no plan, just that something in him told him to keep walking, to find her. When he rounded the corner, he saw her. Ilara. She was alone behind the stable, sweeping the snow off a bench that no one ever sat on. The cold had turned everything into a frozen ghost of its former self. The wood, the air, the silence. Her back was straight, though, despite the chill biting at her. There was a quiet pride about her, something that seemed to mock the world that had tried to bury her. Her wedding dress had long been traded for a plain wool coat, worn and faded from use. Her boots were the kind of practical footwear a person in her situation would need, not for style, but for survival. Still, there was something about the way she moved, something in the defiance of her posture. She wasn't crushed. Not yet. Jedediah stopped a few paces behind her, tipping his battered hat and clearing his throat. Ma'am, he said, his voice low and rough from days of little use. It was a whisper of sound, like it might break apart in the wind. She didn't flinch, didn't turn around at first. When she finally did, her eyes were sharp, cold as the sky above them, the color of winter itself. She took him in with a look that could have stripped the flesh off a man. You here to add your laughter to the chorus? She asked, her voice dry, brittle, each word like a leaf crushed underfoot. Jedediah shook his head slowly, trying to find the right words. No, ma'am, he said quietly, his gaze steady, but not unkind. His breath misted in the cold air as he paused for a moment, finding himself dredging up the honesty that had been buried for so long. I got a cabin. Needs tending. His voice faltered slightly as he glanced down at his boots. I got a boy. He needs more than I can give him alone. He swallowed hard, the words coming slower now, like they were stuck in his chest. And I got more quiet than a man ought to keep. It ain't healthy. Ilara's eyes narrowed, but there was no scorn in them. Instead, they held something else. Something deep and probing, as if she was searching for a lie, a weakness, something that would show him for what he was. He didn't flinch, though, not this time. She stared at him for a long moment, weighing him, seeing through him. Then she spoke again, her voice still harsh but with a bitter edge of curiosity. You offering pity, mister? Or something else? Jedediah paused. He didn't want to offer pity. He didn't want to be that man, the one who saw others as beneath him. He had been that man once, long ago, before the land broke him, before the grief, before everything fell apart. He wasn't sure what he was offering now, but maybe it was enough to try something different. I'm offering winter shelter, ma'am, he said, meeting her gaze directly. Company, if you can abide a quiet man. He let out a slow breath, the weight of his own words settling in. Maybe a second chance, for both of us, at something we both thought we'd lost. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she looked at him, her eyes unreadable, the cold air between them thickening. For a moment, all he could hear was the wind whistling through the empty barn, the scrape of her broom against the frozen bench. She looked like she was trying to make up her mind, trying to decide if the risk was worth it, if the offer was worth trusting. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime of silence, Elara spoke, her voice quieter now, the anger gone, but something else lingering beneath it. "You think we can just start over?" Her words came like a challenge, but there was vulnerability in the way she held herself now, a softness in the lines of her face. "Like that's just something you can fix with a roof and some company?" Jedediah didn't answer right away. He understood what she meant. He had asked himself that question 100 times. Could a man like him, broken by his past, be anything more than what he had become? Could she? Could anyone? The town had cast her out, abandoned her at her most vulnerable moment. He had been there before, even if his circumstances weren't the same. He had been cast aside by the world, too. He met her eyes, steady and unflinching. "I don't know," he said slowly. "But it sure as hell ain't worth anything if we don't try." She studied him for a long moment, her lips tight, the cold wind tugging at her hair. Then, finally, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "All right," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'll take that chance." Jedediah felt the weight lift off his shoulders, just slightly, but it was enough to make the air feel warmer. "We leave in the morning," he said. "We can't waste time." Elara turned back to the bench, her hands still gripping the broom, but now there was something different in the way she held herself. Her shoulders weren't as tight. There was a small, almost imperceptible shift in the air, like the world had, for just a moment, softened. She wasn't the woman abandoned at the altar anymore. She wasn't the joke that everyone laughed at behind closed doors. She was something else, something more. She was a woman who had fought to stay standing, and she wasn't about to fall again. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm not your charity, and I'm not here to make it easier on you either." Jedediah nodded. He hadn't expected her to be anything else. "I never asked you to be," he said, his voice rough but carrying a thread of something like respect. "But we could use someone who knows how to fight." She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes flicking to the cabin he had promised her, and then back to him. "I know how to fight, Jedediah," she said, her lips curling into a small, bitter smile. "I've been fighting my whole damn life." And just like that, they turned toward the future, the shadows of their pasts trailing behind them, but not quite reaching them yet. The wind howled again, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel quite so cold. The snow was thick when they left town the next morning, the world around them blanketed in a cold, indifferent hush. No farewells, no goodbyes. Only the sharp, biting wind and the distant, lingering gazes of townsfolk watching from behind their curtains. Their faces were masks of disinterest, but Jedediah knew better. He could feel the weight of their whispers, the kind that followed you like a shadow, clinging to your heels long after you'd gone. What could they say? Two broken people, setting off into the wilderness to seek what? Redemption? Solace? No, they weren't looking for anything grand, not like that. They were just two flickering embers, smothered by time and loss, struggling to stay alive against a world that had long since turned cold. The ride to the cabin was slow, the snow falling thick and fast, swirling around them in blinding sheets. Elara said nothing, her face hidden beneath the brim of her hat. Jedediah didn't expect anything from her. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of mutual understanding, the kind you get from living too long with your own ghosts. They both carried them, and no words could ever make them disappear. The crunch of hooves in the snow was the only sound for miles, and it felt like the world had disappeared entirely. Jedediah didn't try to fill the quiet with unnecessary talk. What could he say? That the cabin was his only refuge from the storm of his own mind? That Finn, his son, was barely more than a shadow of the boy he used to be? But even the silence seemed too loud for him to voice those truths. When they finally arrived, the cabin stood at the edge of the world, as stark and unforgiving as everything else. It wasn't much, a small shack really, more shelter than home, but it was theirs, for now. The wood was old and weather-beaten, the windows cracked, but it was standing, holding its ground against the storm outside. Ilara dismounted first, her boots crunching against the snow. She stood still for a long moment, her breath misting in the frigid air. She was surveying the place, taking in the sight of it as if she were bracing herself for some new disappointment. Jedediah could see it in the way her shoulders were tight, the way her eyes flicked over the cabin with a kind of wary expectation. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The cabin wasn't much to look at, but it was hers now, too. She didn't have to like it, but it was a start. Finally, Ilara took a deep breath and stepped inside. Jedediah followed her, the door creaking on its hinges as they entered. The cold hit them instantly, sharp and unwelcoming, but it didn't faze her. She didn't wait for him to show her around or make excuses for what the place lacked. Instead, she moved with a quiet purpose, immediately setting to work, wiping down the surfaces, sweeping the floor. It was as if she couldn't bear to let the place remain in its state of disrepair. Jedediah stood in the doorway for a moment watching her. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to take charge, to step into the place like she was already making it her own. Something about the way she moved, the way she didn't hesitate, stirred something in him. It wasn't much, but it was a glimmer. A fragile tendril of hope, curling its way through the depths of his chest, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He almost hated it, that spark, afraid of what it meant. But it was there. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel quite so alone. Ilara worked without speaking, her movements quick and efficient. It was as if she were trying to force warmth into the cold bones of the place, trying to breathe life into something that had long been forgotten. Jedediah watched her for a while, but he didn't say anything. There was no need. She wasn't here for his approval. She was here because she, too, was trying to survive. When she finally paused, wiping the sweat from her brow, Jedediah took a step forward. He cleared his throat, still unsure of what to say, but the words came anyway. "You ever thought about what happens next?" he asked, his voice rough, the question hanging in the air between them. Ilara turned to him, her face shadowed by the dim light from the fire. There was no bitterness in her expression, no sarcasm, just a quiet kind of wariness. "Every damn day," she said softly. "But there's no use thinking about what's next when you can't even get today right." Jedediah nodded, his eyes falling to the ground. She was right, of course. There was no sense in thinking too far ahead. Not when the only thing that mattered was getting through the moment, getting through the day, keeping your feet planted in the cold earth, even when it felt like everything around you was slipping away. She didn't ask for much, but there was something about the way she carried herself that made Jedediah think she was waiting for something too. Maybe it was the same thing he was waiting for. Maybe it was just the chance to stop running, to stop hiding. Ilara returned to her work, her movements slower now, as if the weight of the task had finally caught up with her. Jedediah watched her for a moment longer, feeling a stirring in his chest. He wasn't sure what it meant, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something that wasn't cold. It wasn't love, not yet. Not the kind of love he had once known, but it was something. A connection. A chance to build something from the ashes of their own brokenness. "Thank you," he said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "For being here." Ilara didn't look up right away, but after a moment she nodded. "You're welcome. We'll see what happens next." And with that, the silence returned. But it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't suffocating. It was the kind of silence that allowed room for something to grow, something that might just be worth holding on to. For now, it was enough. The first night in the cabin passed quietly. The fire crackled softly between Jedediah and Alara, its warmth pushing back against the cold that gnawed at the walls, at their bones. The outside world seemed distant, swallowed by the thick blackness of the night, but the wilderness was never truly silent. A coyote's mournful cry rose up from the darkness, echoing through the stillness, like a reminder that the world they had retreated into was wild, untamed, and unforgiving. Alara sat across from him, her eyes flicking to the fire, to the shadows, to anything but him. She wasn't uncomfortable, just patient, like she had learned long ago to make peace with silence. Finally, she broke it. "You always this quiet?" Her voice was softer now, the sharpness gone, replaced by a kind of tentative curiosity. Jedediah glanced at her, his tired eyes catching hers for a fleeting moment. He nodded once, his response simple, unadorned. There wasn't much else to say. Words had always been unnecessary for him. They were like the fire, flickering, fleeting, easily snuffed out. A faint smile touched the corner of Alara's lips, something small but genuine. "My pa used to say too much talking can ruin a good silence. Guess we're a perfect match then." Jedediah didn't respond at first, just let the words hang in the air. There was a softness to her now, an acceptance that hadn't been there before. But they didn't speak of love, or even affection. That kind of talk was far too premature, too fragile for something as complicated as what they were starting to build. There were no promises here, no declarations. They were both too battered for such things. Instead, they shared the warmth of the fire, the steady rhythm of daily chores. She would sweep the floor or tidy the hearth while he chopped wood or tended to the horse. They did the things that needed to be done, and that was enough for now. Small acts of care, unspoken, but felt. As the days passed, Alara began to open up in bits and pieces. She told him of a garden she had once tended, a riot of colors in a place that felt nothing like this gray world of snow and cold. She spoke of a sister who had died too young, the grief of it still sharp in her voice, even years later. And haltingly, she shared the story of the man who had left her standing alone at the altar, his face a mask of sudden, inexplicable revulsion. The pain of it was still there, in the way she held herself, in the way she hesitated before speaking of him. Jedediah listened in silence, offering no judgment, no comfort, only the quiet presence of someone who understood what it meant to be broken. He never interrupted, never tried to make it better. She wasn't looking for that. She just needed to speak her truth, and for now, that was enough. But even in the quiet, there was a slow, steady healing beginning, like the thaw that comes after a long, brutal winter. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Weeks passed before Finn returned. He came in the early afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows over the cabin. His arms were heavy with supplies, dried beans, jerky, and a few other provisions from Mrs. Blackwood, who had been kind enough to give him what she could spare. Her kindness felt like a rare spring flower blooming in the dead of winter, something precious, something that made the cold seem a little less unbearable. When Finn saw Alara, his small face went still, his expression a careful mask of uncertainty. She was a stranger to him, a woman who had appeared without warning, taking up space in their home, in his world. His eyes darted from his father to Alara, then back again, as if seeking permission, seeking reassurance that this new presence wouldn't disrupt the fragile rhythm of his life. Alara, sensing the boy's hesitation, smiled. A warm, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes, softening the hard edges of her face. She knelt before him, her movements slow and careful, as if she understood the weight of the moment. She extended her hand to him, her voice gentle but playful. "You must be Finn," she said, her words soft but laced with warmth. "The young prince of this kingdom, I presume?" Finn looked at his father, seeking some kind of confirmation, some kind of sign that it was okay, that this woman wasn't a threat. Jedediah gave him a small, encouraging nod, the kind of nod that said, "It's all right, son. She's here to stay, and we need to make this work." Finn hesitated, his eyes flicking between the two of them, but then, slowly, he placed his small hand in hers. The gesture was tentative at first, but there was something in it, a small spark of trust, a quiet acknowledgement of the space between them. A silent pact was formed, a bridge built across the chasm of their shared grief. It was a beginning. Nothing more, nothing less. But it was enough for now. Enough to start building something together, something they could hold on to as they navigated this uncertain future. Ilara didn't rush him. She didn't try to force anything. Instead, she held his hand gently, offering him a quiet kind of acceptance. The air in the cabin seemed to change, just a little, as if the three of them, in this small moment, had become something more than just strangers. Something more than just broken pieces of the past. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was something. And in this world, something was better than nothing. As the days turned into weeks, the three of them settled into a routine. Finn helped with the chores in his own way, learning to feed the horse, to chop small pieces of wood, to fetch water from the nearby creek. Jedediah taught him what he knew, not with grand lessons or speeches, but through quiet example. And Ilara. Ilara was there. Every day she was there, tending to the cabin, to the fire, to the small bits of life they were trying to rebuild. There were moments when the weight of their shared history pressed down on them, when the silence between them felt too heavy to bear. But there were also moments when the fire crackled a little louder, when Finn's laughter rang out in the cabin, light and carefree. And in those moments, Jedediah allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were all starting to heal. Days bled into weeks. Winter tightened its icy grip on the land. Food supplies dwindled. The wolves, emboldened by hunger, drew closer to the cabin, their howls a nightly serenade. Jedediah hunted, his skills honed by necessity. Ilara tended the fire, her presence a steadying force, and taught Finn the practical arts of mending torn clothes and stretching meager rations. They learned to depend on one another, not out of desperate need, but out of a slow-growing, unspoken choice. Then came the storm, a true blizzard, a raging beast of wind and snow that howled like a legion of tormented souls. It rolled in with terrifying speed, swallowing the landscape in a blinding white fury. The cabin roof groaned under the weight of accumulating snow. The fire sputtered and spat, fighting a losing battle against the drafts that snaked through the chinking. Jedediah, his face grim, rushed outside to secure Bess and the few chickens they possessed. Ilara stayed inside with Finn, her calm demeanor a shield against the boy's rising fear. That night, amidst the storm's crescendo, another sound sliced through the wind's roar, the muffled beat of hooves, too urgent, too close. Three riders, their faces obscured by scarves and the deep shadows of their hats, materialized out of the swirling snow. Strangers rarely visited in such weather unless they brought trouble. Jedediah met them at the door, his old shotgun held steady in his hands. "We're looking for shelter," one of the men growled, his voice rough, eyes glinting with malice. "Our camp washed out." Jedediah didn't lower the gun. His own eyes, narrowed and cold as the wind, scanned the men. "Ain't got much to share. Barely enough for ourselves." Their eyes flickered past him, drawn to the faint, inviting glow of the fire within. One of them, bolder than the others, took a menacing step forward, his hand inching towards the pistol at his hip. "Looks like you got more than you need, old man. And we ain't asking nice anymore." A wave of cold dread washed over Jedediah, colder than the storm. This was it. The moment he'd feared, alone with a boy and a woman who was practically a stranger. The cold Jedediah felt wasn't just from the snow driving against his face. It was the bone-deep chill that precedes violence, the kind that comes before something precious breaks. "Leave now," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, betraying none of the fear knotting his gut. They didn't. They smirked, exchanging glances, and the leader lunged. That's when the shot rang out, deafeningly loud, not from Jedediah's gun but from inside the cabin. The lead rider's hat flew from his head as if snatched by an invisible hand. He yelped, a strangled sound of shock and pain, stumbling back, clutching his head. The other two froze, their bravado vanishing like smoke in the wind. Alara stood in the doorway, framed by the dim light, a rifle held firmly in her hands, her face a mask of fierce determination, her eyes as hard and unyielding as granite. "You heard him," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the storm's howl and the ringing in Jedediah's ears. "This ain't your place. Get!" They fled without another word, scrambling onto their horses and vanishing into the blizzard as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind only the echo of their panicked curses and the faint smell of gunpowder. Jedediah stared at Alara, his heart still pounding, a mixture of shock and dawning respect washing over him. She hadn't flinched. She had acted. Jedediah looked at her then, truly looked at her, not as a burden, not as a reminder of what he'd lost, but as the woman who had just stood between his son and potential death, a rifle her only argument. That night, after the fire was built high and the door securely bolted, he poured her the last of their weak coffee. "I never asked your name," he said, the words feeling inadequate. A small, tired smile touched her lips. "Alara. And you never needed to ask, Jedediah. Some things are understood without words." The snow, relentless and unforgiving, continued for 3 more days, piling in monstrous drifts against the cabin walls, transforming the familiar pines into skeletal white statues. A profound, muffling silence descended, as if the land itself had fallen into a deep, exhausted slumber. Inside, they burned through the last of their dry wood. The cold, an insidious serpent, crept in through every crack and crevice, no matter how high the fire blazed. Each breath emerged as a small, ghostly plume of steam. Yet no one complained. Finn, drawn by an unspoken magnetism, stuck close to Alara. She told him stories in a low, steady voice, tales of clever foxes outwitting hunters, of brave girls who crossed raging rivers alone, of mothers who outsmarted cunning outlaws. Finn watched her, his eyes wide, drinking in her words as if he'd been starved for them his entire life. Jedediah observed this transformation, not with envy, but with a quiet, profound relief. He remembered the way Finn used to chatter to Martha, his small hands clutching her apron. After her passing, a silence had fallen over the boy, not just in words, but in spirit. Now, that vital spark was returning, fanned by Alara's quiet strength. This woman, this bride no one had wanted, was giving his son something Jedediah, in his grief, couldn't: the warmth of being truly seen, truly heard. On the 4th day, the storm finally broke, succeeded by a silence so deep it felt fragile, breakable. Jedediah stepped outside, the glare of the sun on the pristine snow momentarily blinding him. The world was a canvas of untouched white, beautiful but deceptive. Snow could hide anything: a treacherous hole, a coiled snake, a waiting enemy. His eyes, trained by years of solitude, scanned the landscape. Then he saw them. Tracks. Boot prints, fresh, stark against the virgin snow. He knelt, studying their direction, the depth of the impression. They came from the west, circling the cabin at a distance, watching, not approaching, not fleeing, just observing. When he returned inside, his face was grim, but he said nothing. No need to alarm Alara and Finn. Not yet. But that night he sat up longer than usual, the shotgun resting across his lap, his senses heightened. 2 days later, they found it. A gutted deer, strung up from a low-hanging branch, not 20 yards from their woodpile. Still warm, its blood dripping like crimson ink onto the white snow. It wasn't a kill for food, it was a message, crude and brutal. He knew what it meant. This wasn't over. Alara saw it too. When their eyes met over the gruesome discovery, an unspoken understanding passed between them. She didn't flinch. She didn't suggest they leave or run. Instead, she dragged in more wood, fed the fire until it roared defiantly, and began to teach Finn, with calm, methodical precision, how to load Jedediah's spare rifle. "I was raised amongst men who thought a woman too delicate to hold steel," she said, her hands surprisingly steady as she guided Finn's smaller ones. "Turns out, sometimes the delicate ones are the only ones who know how to use it when it counts." That night, they locked every door and window. Bess and the chickens were brought into the makeshift lean-to they'd patched together with tarps and pine boughs. Jedediah slept in his chair, the shotgun never more than an arm's reach away. The attack came just before dawn, the darkest hour. They heard Bess first, a high, panicked whinny, followed by the frantic clucking of the chickens. Then, the shattering of glass as the small window at the back of the cabin imploded. Jedediah was on his feet in an instant, firing into the darkness without hesitation, the roar of the shotgun deafening in the confined space. Finn, clutching an old quilt, scrambled into the corner farthest from the breach, as instructed. Alara, her face set in a grim mask, grabbed the rifle she'd kept near the hearth. There was no fear in her hands, only a cold, burning resolve. They moved with an instinctive, unspoken coordination, covering doors and windows as if they'd drilled for this moment all their lives. When one of the shadowy figures burst through the front door, silhouetted against the pre-dawn gloom, Alara fired first. The man crumpled without a sound, a look of stark surprise frozen on his face. The remaining attackers, their courage shattered by the fierce, unexpected resistance, melted back into the darkness. Afterward, in the gray, somber light of dawn, they buried the body. No words were spoken, only the grunts of effort and the scrape of the shovel against frozen earth. Snow began to fall softly again, a gentle shroud covering the raw wound in the ground, the bloodstains and trampled boot prints, as if the land itself sought to forget the violence that had scarred its surface. The finality of the act settled heavily upon them. Later that evening, while Finn slept soundly, exhausted but safe, the terrors of the night momentarily banished by the deep slumber of youth, and the fire cracked low, a comforting sound in the heavy silence, Jedediah sat across from Alara. The cabin felt small, intimate, the world outside held at bay by their shared ordeal. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket, Martha's. His heart clenched. This was a piece of his soul he hadn't shared with anyone. He looked at it for a long moment, his thumb rubbing over the worn engraving of a single blue bell, Martha's favorite. The memories, sharp and bittersweet, washed over him. Then, with a deep breath that seemed to carry the weight of years, he leaned forward and placed it gently in Alara's calloused, capable hand. "She would have liked you, Alara," he said, his voice rough with unshed emotion, the words costing him more than he could say. "She would have admired your spirit, your fight." Alara's fingers closed around the cool metal. She didn't speak, just looked from the locket to his face, her eyes, usually so guarded, now glistening in the firelight, reflecting a depth of understanding that needed no words. A single tear traced a path down her weathered cheek. It wasn't a tear of sorrow, but of something more complex, acknowledgement, perhaps, or a shared burden of survival. That night, they didn't sleep apart, not out of want, or even desperate need, but because something profound between them had shifted, solidified, like river ice in the depths of winter. A fragile trust, born of shared danger and mutual respect, had taken root. She was no longer the bride left behind, the object of pity or scorn. She was the woman who had chosen to stay, to fight, to build alongside him. She was, in a way, Martha could never be again, his partner, a shield against the wilderness, both outside and within. Spring, when it finally arrived, came late and reluctantly to the high country. It crept in like a cautious stranger, melting the snow in patches, turning the trails to thick, sucking mud, and stirring the dormant smells of damp earth and resinous pine. The river, freed from its icy prison, broke loose first, a roaring, tumultuous torrent rushing past the rocks near the cabin. Birds returned, their songs a cheerful, tentative chorus. Tiny, uncertain buds appeared on the skeletal branches of the aspens. And with the thaw came visitors, some welcome, some decidedly not. It was during a lull, a deceptively peaceful stretch of early summer before their move to Clearwater at the old cabin. A man, lean and weathered, with eyes that held a restless, predatory glint, had ridden up. He called himself Elias Thorne. He claimed to be an old friend of Alara's from back east, fallen on hard times, seeking a few days' shelter before moving on. Alara had gone pale when she saw him, a flicker of old fear, quickly suppressed in her eyes. "Elias," she'd acknowledged, her voice carefully neutral. "It's been many years." Jedediah, sensing the undercurrent, had been wary. Thorne was charming, with a ready smile and a repository of engaging stories, but there was a darkness clinging to him, an edge that set Jedediah on alert. He'd offered Thorne the barn loft. For 2 days, Thorne had been a model guest, but his eyes often followed Alara, a possessive, almost hungry look that made Jedediah's hackles rise. The third night, the pretense shattered. Jedediah, feigning sleep in his chair by the hearth, his shotgun close, heard Thorne creep from the barn. He didn't go for supplies or the outhouse. He moved with stealth towards the main cabin. Jedediah waited, every nerve taut. He found him not by the rifle, but a dark shape pressing close to the cabin wall, listening at the small window near where Alara slept on her cot. "Alara," Thorne hissed, his voice a low, venomous whisper that carried clearly in the still night air. The charm was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate anger. "You think you can hide from me out here in this God-forsaken wilderness? You left me for ruin, woman, took my prospects, my good name, and vanished like a thief in the night. You thought you could just disappear and forget the debt you owe me? I've come to collect, one way or another." Jedediah stepped out of the cabin's deep shadows, the double barrels of the shotgun glinting faintly in the moonlight. "She owes you nothing, Thorne, and your welcome here is over. Time you moved on." Thorne whirled, his face contorted into a mask of fury when he saw Jedediah. "This ain't your concern, sodbuster," he snarled, his eyes wild. "This is between me and her. She destroyed me." He lunged, not at Jedediah, but with surprising speed towards the cabin door, fumbling for something at his belt. But Alara was already there, framed in the doorway, a heavy iron skillet gripped tightly in her hand, her face pale but resolute. "I left you, Elias," she said, her voice trembling but firm, cutting through his tirade. "Because you were a cheat, a liar, and a bully, dragging everyone around you into your mire of deceit. The only debt here is the misery you caused Abigail and then me." The confrontation was brief, brutal, and desperate. Thorne, fueled by years of festering resentment and a twisted sense of entitlement, was reckless. He pulled a wicked-looking knife. Jedediah moved, deflecting the clumsy slash, the shotgun proving an effective barrier. Before Thorne could recover, Alara, with a surprising ferocity born of old fear and new resolve, swung the heavy skillet. It connected with the side of Thorne's head with a sickening thud, sending him staggering back, dazed and cursing. Jedediah disarmed him swiftly. They bound him securely with rope from the barn. At dawn, Jedediah, his face grim, escorted a bruised and sullen Thorne miles from their land, with a stark, unequivocal warning never to return. The encounter left Alara shaken, pale, the confrontation dredging up painful memories she had long tried to bury. But it also solidified something powerful between her and Jedediah. He hadn't questioned her past, hadn't doubted her word against Thorne's accusations. He had simply stood with her, a silent, unshakable protector. "He won't be back," Jedediah had said gruffly later, seeing the lingering fear in her eyes. "Some dogs only bark until they meet a wolf." That night, huddled by the fire, she told Jedediah more about her life before, the betrayals and hardships, the desperation that had led her to that fateful mail-order advertisement, a last gamble that had ended in public humiliation, but paradoxically had led her here, to this improbable, hard-won sanctuary, and to him. They had just finished planting the first rows of potatoes on what would become the Clearwater homestead, their hands caked with rich, dark earth, when a sharp knock echoed from their temporary shelter, a lean-to against the wagon. Jedediah answered it. A man stood there, tall and imposing, dressed in city clothes, Marcus Vance, Alara's supposed family. His visit was tense. He stayed for supper, his questions too pointed, his eyes lingering on their meager defenses. He left the next morning with cold eyes. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived, delivered by a circuit rider. It was sealed with an unfamiliar wax emblem. Inside, neat, precise handwriting on expensive paper explained that Alara, through her late sister Abigail, had come into ownership of a significant tract of land, 30 acres bordering the swift-flowing Clearwater River, rich with virgin timber and crucial water rights. It was the very land they were now tentatively trying to claim. The letter was from a land brokerage firm in the eastern cities, formally notifying her. Vance had known. He had come to gauge her awareness, her strength. Alara folded the letter slowly, her knuckles white. A storm of emotions played across her face, disbelief, then a dawning, fierce joy, quickly followed by a cold, hard anger. "They thought I'd just hand it over," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Vance, he thought I was an old, broken fool, that I'd be too stupid or too soft to keep what's mine, what Abigail wanted me to have." A single tear of outrage escaped and tracked down her cheek. Jedediah watched the fire ignite in her eyes, a blaze of determination that warmed him to his core. "You want to claim it, Alara?" he asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. "It'll be a fight. Vance won't let it go easy." "Claim it?" Her head snapped up, her gaze locking with his, fierce and unwavering. "I want to build on it," she declared, her voice ringing with a sudden, unshakable conviction. Her eyes shifted to Finn, who was outside skipping stones across the creek that bordered their claimed patch, the spring sun catching the gold in his hair. For him. For us. A place no one can take away. The decision was made. The stakes were clear. This wasn't just about shelter anymore. It was about a future. The journey to town that Sunday was charged with unspoken tension. Alara, in her patched dress, sat straighter. Jedediah, his old coat a familiar comfort, felt a grim resolve. Finn rode between them, sensing the gravity. Marcus Vance stood near the newly built courthouse, flanked by 2 men in dark city suits, a smirk on his face. "Well, Alara," he began, holding up a sheaf of papers. "I've filed a formal claim. Abigail was never legally married. The land, by rights of kinship and prior agreements, falls to me." Alara dismounted, her movements deliberate. She stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. She pulled out the letter from the brokerage firm, and then, with a small, almost triumphant flourish, another, smaller, more potent document. This one, bearing the seal of a circuit judge, granted her full and clear title to the Clearwater property, supported by sworn statements from several townsfolk, people who, inspired by Alara's resilience, had spoken the truth about Abigail's wishes and Vance's dubious character. "You thought I wouldn't fight, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush that fell over the onlookers. Her voice didn't shake. It was cold, sharp steel. "You thought I was just some leftover woman, easily swept aside. But I've fought harder things than scheming little men in fancy suits. I've faced down blizzards, starvation, and men with guns who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. You're just an inconvenience I intend to remove." Vance's smirk faltered, then vanished entirely, replaced by a look of stunned, slack-jawed disbelief. His lawyerly companions began to shuffle uncomfortably, avoiding his gaze. The crowd murmured. Defeated, his arrogance shattered, Vance left town that afternoon, a shadow of his former self. As they rode back to Clearwater, Ilara's shoulders were straighter, her head held high. The land ahead seemed to welcome them, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. It was theirs, truly theirs. The construction of the new cabin was no easy feat. It took weeks of backbreaking labor, the kind that gnawed at the edges of a man's bones and forced him to keep pushing, even when his muscles screamed for rest. Jedediah, worn and weathered by a life of struggle, fell back into the rhythm of work with a quiet determination, his hands calloused and rough. Ilara, surprisingly strong for a woman who had been through so much, worked beside him every day, her energy relentless and her will as hard as the logs they stacked. She was no delicate thing. She had her own scars, her own resilience. Finn, small for his age but eager to prove himself, worked too. His hands were still soft, his movements awkward, but he tried. He cut his first log, and Jedediah had watched, quietly proud, as the boy struggled, then smiled when he finished. They didn't say much to each other, but the bond was there, slowly growing in the shared sweat and effort. Each day, the cabin rose from the ground, one log at a time, until it finally stood as a shelter, a humble, solid structure that they could call their own. The evenings were quieter, though. After the day's labor, when the fire crackled and the scent of cooking food hung in the air, they would sit together. Jedediah would pull out his old harmonica and play a mournful tune, one that spoke of loss and longing, of roads traveled and journeys yet to come. Ilara would hum along, her voice low and soft, carrying the melody with a warmth that Jedediah had never expected from her. There was a comfort in their quiet nights, a tentative peace that they shared even without words. On other nights, Ilara would tell stories. She spoke of pioneers who had carved lives from the wilderness, who had braved the hardships of the frontier and built something lasting from nothing but grit and dreams. Her stories were always infused with the kind of strength that Jedediah had admired in her from the beginning. They were stories of survival, of stubborn will, and of the belief that anyone, even someone as broken as her, could start over. Jedediah listened, absorbing her words, not just as tales but as blueprints for the life they were trying to build together. But peace, like anything else, was fleeting. The first cracks in their newfound tranquility came with the arrival of Reverend Blackwood. At first, he seemed like just another figure in the town, polite, helpful, offering his kindness to Finn with the air of someone trying to do right by a young boy. But Jedediah had learned long ago to be wary of the kindness of strangers. It was often a mask, one that hid something darker underneath. Blackwood's true nature slowly revealed itself, one small, subtle action at a time. The way his eyes lingered on the land they were working to settle, the way he casually mentioned the old cabin site, now mostly unused, as if it were nothing but an abandoned relic. He'd even suggested, in a roundabout way, that the site could serve the community, as if it were something to be claimed, something to be used for the greater good. Jedediah didn't trust him, not for a second. His gut told him that the preacher wasn't interested in helping anyone but himself. And sure enough, one blustery afternoon, word came that Blackwood had shown up at the old cabin with a surveyor, claiming that the town council was reclaiming the property for the community. The words hit Jedediah like a punch in the stomach. There was no damn reclaiming to be done. This land was his and Finn's. It was a land of broken promises, of lost time, but it was theirs all the same. And no one, not even Blackwood, had any right to take it from them. The sky was darkening when Jedediah and Alara rode out to the old cabin, their horses galloping hard over the rocky terrain. The wind had picked up, the clouds swirling ominously above them. It felt like the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. A premature autumn storm was brewing, one that would bring the first of the season's snow, thick and heavy, the kind that would blind you if you weren't careful. The storm wasn't just in the air, though. It was in them, too. The betrayal, the anger, the injustice. They all twisted together, like the wind that whipped leaves into frantic dances. "Damn him," Jedediah muttered under his breath, his teeth clenched. "I knew it. I knew he was after something." Alara, her face set, didn't say anything at first. She was used to this, used to the betrayal, used to the way people thought they could take what wasn't theirs. Her eyes were hard as she urged her horse faster, following Jedediah's lead. When they reached the cabin, Blackwood and his surveyor were already there, their horses tied to the nearby tree, the surveyor's measuring tools set up on the ground. Blackwood stood by the door, his hands clasped behind his back, watching them approach with a smug smile on his face, like he knew he was about to win. Jedediah didn't stop. He urged his horse forward, pulling to a quick halt just inches from Blackwood, his gaze as cold as the storm brewing overhead. "You've got no right to be here," Jedediah's voice was a low growl, full of quiet fury. "This land is mine. You stay the hell away from it." Blackwood didn't flinch. His smile didn't falter. "The town has decided, Jedediah. This land was abandoned. The council wants it for the community's use." Jedediah's anger flared. "It ain't abandoned. It's mine. And I've worked this land with my own hands. Ain't no council, no preacher, no man alive who's gonna take it from me." Blackwood's smile twisted into something sharper, something colder. "You'll find the law's a powerful thing in these parts. A preacher's word can carry a lot of weight, Jedediah." Jedediah dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. The air between them thickened with tension, the storm now more than just a metaphor. He stepped toward Blackwood, his fists clenched, and for a moment it seemed like the storm itself was waiting, holding its breath. Alara dismounted beside him, her face hard, her jaw tight. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was a force, a steady reminder of everything they'd fought for. The surveyor, a skinny man with a nervous twitch in his hands, looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. He stepped back, not wanting to get caught in whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "Take your surveyor and get out," Jedediah said, his voice quiet but final. "You've got no claim here, Blackwood. Not now, not ever." For a moment it seemed like Blackwood might resist, might press further, but then something in his eyes shifted, a flicker of something. Fear, perhaps, or recognition that he'd miscalculated. Slowly he stepped back, his smile fading. "You'll regret this, Jedediah," he said, his voice thin, barely more than a whisper. Jedediah didn't respond. He simply turned, his boots crunching in the snow as he walked away from Blackwood, back to the cabin that was his. Alara stood still for a moment, watching Blackwood retreat. When he was finally gone, she turned to Jedediah, her expression unreadable. "Do you think he'll give up?" Jedediah didn't look back. He simply shook his head, his hand resting on the doorframe of the cabin. "No," he said quietly, "but neither will I." And with that, they turned back toward the life they were building. The storm was still raging, but it didn't matter. They had something worth fighting for now, and they weren't about to let anyone take it from them. They arrived to find Blackwood indeed with a nervous-looking surveyor and two thuggish men Jedediah didn't recognize, their faces set in expressions of smug assurance. The wind howled around them, plucking at their clothes. "Reverend," Jedediah said, his voice dangerously calm as he dismounted, Alara beside him, her rifle held loosely but purposefully. The air crackled with tension, thicker than the coming storm. "This is still my land. Blackwood turned, feigning surprise that was wholly unconvincing. "Jedediah, Ilara, my dear friends, I was just ensuring its upkeep." There were concerns voiced in the council about it falling into disrepair, becoming a blight. And young Finn, he deserves to see his heritage preserved, perhaps as a community space, a schoolhouse he can always visit and feel proud of. His voice was smooth, pious, but his eyes held a greedy glint. "Finn's heritage is with us, Reverend," Ilara cut in, her voice sharp as flint. "On land we work with our own hands, land we defend with our lives if need be, not as a pawn in your schemes to acquire property under the guise of piety." It was then that Finn, who had been trailing them quietly on his pony, urged his mount forward. He'd grown in the past months, not just in height, but in a quiet confidence Ilara had meticulously nurtured. The wind whipped his hair across his face, but his gaze was steady, fixed on the preacher. "Reverend Blackwood," Finn said, his voice surprisingly clear and strong, cutting through the rising wind. "You told Mrs. Abernathy just last week down by the mercantile that my pa didn't care about this old place anymore. You said he'd likely let it go for a song if the church made a charitable offer. You also said," Finn paused, his eyes unwavering, "that I'd be better off living in town with you and Mrs. Blackwood, so I could learn proper godly ways, because Ma Ilara was, your words were, uncivilized and perhaps a mite touched by the wild." A deathly hush fell, broken only by the whistling wind. Mrs. Abernathy was a notorious town gossip, but also fiercely loyal to those she considered wronged, and her word carried weight. Blackwood's face, moments before so composed, turned a mottled, furious red. His composure began to crack. Finn continued, his quiet voice an indictment more powerful than any shout. "And those two men with you? They aren't townsfolk. They were asking a lot of questions down at the saloon about Pa's trapping lines up north of here, the ones that always do well in winter. Asking who held the rights, and if Pa ever talked about selling those rights cheap. The boy's hidden power, honed by quiet observation and a fierce love for his found family, was not supernatural, but something just as potent. An uncanny ability to listen, to see beneath the surface, to piece together the hidden truths from whispers, glances, and unguarded moments. He had been Blackwood's unseen, underestimated shadow in town, absorbing the preacher's mounting duplicity. The surveyor looked acutely uneasy, avoiding everyone's eyes. The two thugs shifted their weight, their bluster deflating. Blackwood sputtered, "The boy is confused. He's twisting innocent words. This is slander." But the damage was done. Finn's quiet, precise accusation, delivered with an unnerving adult calm, had stripped away Blackwood's pious facade, revealing the grasping greed beneath. The storm, which had been threatening with growing intensity, broke then with a furious clap of thunder and a sudden, violent deluge of rain, as if nature itself was passing a damning judgment. Blackwood and his men, their scheme exposed, their authority crumbling under the weight of a child's undeniable truth and the sudden, drenching fury of the elements, retreated in disarray, soaked to the bone and utterly humiliated. That night, back in the warm, dry sanctuary of the Clearwater cabin, the storm still raging outside like a defeated beast, Jedediah looked at Finn with a profound, overwhelming pride. "You stood up to him, son. You spoke truth to power when grown men hesitated." Finn, huddled by the fire with Ilara's arm around him, managed a small, tired smile. "Ilara taught me that truth is the sharpest weapon, Pa. And that listening, really listening, is as important as talking." Ilara squeezed his shoulder, her eyes shining with love and pride. The storm outside was fierce, a maelstrom of wind and rain, but inside their small cabin, a different kind of strength was being forged in its crucible, a bond tempered by shared adversity, fierce loyalty, and the unshakable courage to defend what was theirs. The land, their family, the hard-won truth. These were their foundations, and no storm, natural or man-made, could easily wash them away. Years passed. The Clearwater homestead thrived. The cabin grew, room by room, as their lives expanded. They took in 2 orphaned children from a nearby settlement ravaged by fever, their small hands and hesitant smiles slowly filling the spaces left by past sorrows. People in the scattered community began to call Ilara Ma Ilara, a term of respect and affection. Jedediah, though he never sought it, became known as Boss Jed, a man whose word was his bond, whose judgment was fair. Finn grew into a young man, tall and lean, his eyes holding the quiet wisdom of the wild, tempered by Ilara's compassionate teachings. He was known far beyond their valley as the son of the warrior woman who had faced down outlaws, and the quiet cowboy who had taught him how to read the land and live without fear. When he eventually left to start his own homestead further west, he carried with him Jedediah's old harmonica, Ilara's spare rifle, and a heart full of stories told by firelight. But even after Finn and the other children grew and moved on, the cabin on the Clearwater never felt empty. What Jedediah and Ilara had built wasn't just walls and fences, crops and livestock. It was something intangible, yet more enduring, a legacy of resilience, a testament to the enduring power of love found in the most unlikely of places, stitched together by shared hardship and unwavering loyalty. When strangers, new settlers drawn by tales of the fertile valley, would occasionally ride down the trail asking about the legendary couple who had tamed a piece of the wild, folks would point towards the smoke rising steady and strong from the chimney of the cabin by the river. They still live there, they'd say with a mixture of awe and respect. Ma Ilara and Boss Jed built their own kind of heaven with nothing but bare hands and stubborn hearts. And sometimes, if the wind was right, carrying sound across the whispering pines and the murmuring Clearwater, you could almost hear the faint, sweet strains of an old harmonica, a melody of survival, of love, of a home finally truly found. The storms had passed, leaving behind a quiet strength, and the land, once a harsh adversary, had become their steadfast ally.